Hello, everyone, and welcome to Finding Family Facts, a program of CAL's Butler Center for Arkansas Studies. I'm Heather Register Zabindon, Outreach Coordinator for the Bobby L. Roberts Library of Arkansas History and Art. We are located at 401 President Clinton Avenue in downtown Little Rock. We're across from the River Market District, right there at the corner of Rock and Clinton, across from the main library, if that gives you an idea. The Roberts Library Research Room is open Tuesday through Friday, 10 to 5, and every Saturday from noon until 4. The CAL's Roberts Library and the Butler Center for Arkansas Studies have an extensive collection of genealogical reference materials. This includes books, microfilm, and other print resources that are at Roberts that are non-circulating. So you must come to this library to use them. We also have computers for you to do genealogy research on databases like Ancestry.com and newspapers.com with the help of our genealogist. Most of our databases we refer to during today's program are available for use at any CAL's branch. If you're tuning in from outside of Central Arkansas, check with your local library. They might subscribe to these databases as well. So a couple of announcements. Save the date, October 1st will be our annual genealogy workshop at Ron Robinson Theater. That's Ron Robinson Theater, not Robinson Auditorium. So it will be an all-day workshop. It'll be hybrid, so it'll be in person as well as on Zoom, so you can pick which way you want to participate. And the guest speaker will be a genealogist by the name of Lori Thornton. This will not be recorded and it won't be shown after. So it's a one-day event. You have to be there either in person or virtually that day in order to see it. We also have a do-it-yourself memory lab that's now open on the 3rd floor of Roberts Library. It's open Tuesday through Friday, 10:15 to 4:30. You do have to make an appointment, and we really encourage folks to take one of our personal archiving classes before using the memory lab. Currently, the flatbed scanner station is open for patrons to scan their photos up to 11 by 14. You can also scan mounted slides and film negatives. The AV station will open in early August. We're shooting for August 9th. And at that station, you'll be able to digitize your VHS, your beta, mini DV, as well as audio cassettes. Appointments are available on Saturdays, but you just need to contact me directly to get a Saturday appointment. And so now let me introduce Rhonda Stewart. She is our local history and genealogy specialist. I always have trouble. It's been 2 years that I've been saying your title and I always get it wrong. But she knows a whole lot about genealogy, a whole lot about local Arkansas and Little Rock history. She's been around a long time, and I mean that as a compliment. So she's going to do the program today, and so I'm going to let you take it away, and Rhonda, and after she does her presentation, then we'll take questions.
All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's a big crowd. I'm glad you all decided to attend. I must say, as I always do, I still don't like Zoom classes. I'm an in-person type of person, but that's okay. I've adjusted. We adjust, we adapt, or we die. I've adjusted to this Zoom. What I'm doing today is actually talking to you all about genealogy. And I don't know, because this is once a month and it's fairly free-flowing. Sometimes I worry about repeating myself, but that's also a good thing sometimes because we get new people every month. So if I'm repeating myself to some of you, I apologize. And if not, hopefully you'll still get something from what I have to say today. What I'm looking at today is confirming oral history with documentation. And this crossed my mind over the weekend when somebody asked me, I don't know how many times, how did I get started in genealogy? And the reason and the way I got started in genealogy, I consider a fluke. I'm one of those rebellious children You tell me I can't do something, I will do it for the most part, just to prove you wrong. And my grandmother passed in 1997, and that was my best friend in the whole world. From the day I was born, she was my best friend, and I knew she was my best friend, and I think she knew she was my best friend because as a child, I had allergies and I had to stay in the house with her. And my activities were limited because if I went outside, a lot of times the heat or whatever would start my nose to bleed. So I'd stand at the window while she was doing her chores, ironing. She did ironing as a business out of their own, and tell her what all the other grandchildren were doing in the backyard. So I became a journalist by nature. Some people just say I was a snitch, most of my relatives, but that was how it all started. Because standing in that window telling her what the other children were doing, I had to be very descriptive in the details. Who's doing what? How close are they to the clothesline? Are they stepping in the garden? Did that ball bounce off a window or something? Every little detail. But also, I got to play Ask Any Question with her. That meant I could ask her any question I wanted to ask her. And she would always tell me, you can ask any question you want to. You might not like the answer, but never be afraid to ask the question. So I always ask questions. And that was the beginning of my journalism career, I believe. But like I was saying, when she passed, I heard her youngest daughter, say all that stuff mama said wasn't true. And I got upset with her because we weren't that far apart in age and we were always debating things. She was a very smart woman, but she could be very argumentative. And I didn't like to argue, but I like to prove my point. So I set out and went to the public library in 1997. And I started doing my own little research to find out if I could prove what Mama Lily said was true. And I started with city directories. And the library had a genealogist at the time named Linda McDowell. And she introduced me to the Ancestry database. And I was like, oh, this is real cool. And a few other things, some books around the library that they had at the time. And so I was able to take the oral history that I remembered my grandmother sharing with me and use it to find documentation to prove her story was correct and my aunt was wrong. That same aunt is the reason why I'm working at the library today, because when a position opened up later for an assistant genealogist, I happened to be without a job at that moment. And she was like, oh, you ought to apply for this. And I don't want to do nothing she wanted me to do anyway. So I was like, they ain't gonna hire me. I'm not going to do it. And she kept on me because she was my aunt, and I eventually listened to my elders, even when I don't want to. And she convinced me to at least apply for the job to see what happened. I applied for the job and I got it. Here I am 17 years later, still doing the same thing, but I love it. I don't like working. I do like the work that I do. So there's a distinction. I like helping people finding their family members and finding history they didn't know based off of what they think they know or what they maybe did know from experience of living with a grandparent or great grandparent or just hearing the stories. So oral history is how I began this whole fascination with genealogy. And so the oral history that my grandmother gave me was quite extensive. She knew the names of her grandparents and her parents, of course, but that was as far as it went to her grandparents. So I had a good leg up, I thought. And I was able, like I said, to find the documentation to prove what she said was correct and to correct my aunt's interpretation of what she thought my grandmother knew and didn't know. So if we go to the next slide, Heather, we're going to show you how I confirmed oral history with documentation. So what details were passed on? And I'm looking at both sides of the family, my grandmother and my grandfather, because that's how I got to be who I am. My grandmother is Lily Stewart Toombs. And Mom Lily is what we called her. And I always remember asking her questions. What were your parents' names? She told me her parents' name was Nita, and her mother's name was Nita. Her father was Charlie, Big Charlie, as they called him. And so I knew that. And she said her mother's parents were, they called him Babs Rowland. His name was John Rowland, but they called him Babs. So I had a nickname and I had a full name, a legal name. And then her grandmother's name was Mariah. Mariah Rowland. They called her Skeet. In my head, I was like, oh, she must have been thin like a mosquito because my grandmother's thin. And it's like they probably called her Skeet because that was short for mosquito. Babs, I couldn't figure out why they would call him Babs, but that was the name everybody knew him as. And so I looked for both names when I started researching records. I looked for John Rowland, I looked for Babs Rowland, I looked for Mariah Rowland, I looked for Skeet Rowland. And eventually I found those names on some documentation, which made me believe they were at least true. Her parents' names and her grandparents' names were true. Now with Nita, her mother's name, the only name I ever heard for her was Nita. But I have an aunt whose name is Ruth Juanita. And I'm thinking Nita's full name was actually Juanita, and they just never called her Juanita. They always called her Nita. And it turned out she was an only child, I thought, but when I looked at records, I found out that she may not have been the only child. She's just the only child that lived to be an adult or that lived to have children, because I found a record where Mariah Holyfield Rowland was her name, had other children. And one census record, it says she had given birth to 13 children, but only one was alive at the time of that census. And so I was like, there's got to be Nita, because she would have been around that age. She was the only child that lived out of 13. So that's impressive for me, because without Nita, I wouldn't be here. And so I was like, okay, this is kind of good. Getting proof of what Mama Lily said. And she said, well, I knew she grew up because she in Morrilton, because they always talked about Morrilton, Arkansas. And we visited Morrilton a couple of times when I was a child. So I knew that was where she was from. And so I got to digging around, and I remember some of the names of some of the friends she talked about and what was going on. So I was researching a lot in Conway County, Morrilton, Arkansas. I knew the names of my grandmother's siblings because 3 of her sisters I met, they were still alive. And so I knew them all. And one of her brothers I met because he lived in the area after he retired from the military. And so I knew him, and he liked to draw horses. And I would ask him, Uncle Johnny, why you draw horses all the time? He said, because my grandmother had a horse. She had a white horse. Well, I had heard the story of the white horse from several of my grandmother's siblings. And so I was like, okay, she really did have a white horse. And then one day I found a record where she was paying taxes on a horse. I'm like, oh, she did own a horse. And it blew my mind because in school, people told me women didn't own property in the 1800s. Women didn't do this, women didn't do that. Da, 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 da. Don't believe the hype. Go prove them wrong. Because I found that tax record, and it was late 1800s, I believe, and she paid taxes on that horse. So it was her horse. It wasn't her husband's horse. It was hers. And so I had the proof that I needed that Mariah actually did own a horse. And by oral history, I knew it was a white horse because that's what they always said. And my Aunt Ruth, my grandmother's oldest sister, spent most of her adult life in Chicago. And her occupation was going to the racetrack every day or every other day or something like that. And when I went to live with Aunt Ruth, I was in my late 20s. And she wouldn't let me get a job because she thought it was too dangerous for me to work. And so we went to the racetrack every other day or so. And I never won anything. And she asked me why I stopped betting. I give her her money back. I said, because it's not my money. I'm not winning because it's not my money. That was my mentality. And she was okay with that. But I could only stay 6 months because she didn't want me to work. She didn't want me to leave the house. And that was not like me. As a matter of fact, she offered to pay somebody to give me a job, and I got upset and left. Because I'm like, I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas. I've never paid anybody to give me a job. They paid me to come work for them. So I was in my feelings. I left, came back home. But while I was there with Aunt Ruth, I got more details about the family. And she remembered some of the names of the siblings because she was the older sister that did not live to see childhood or adulthood. And so I had all those names in the back of my head. And when the state of Arkansas published their database of Arkansas deaths a couple of years ago, I started going through it and looking for certain names in Conway County. And I found at least 7 of those children that did not live to be an adult that were part of my family and siblings of my grandmother and her sisters and brothers. And so that was kind of cool. Again, proving that oral history that I knew I had, that she said, I was able to prove it right. Now, my grandfather was a little bit different. He was older than my grandmother, and He knew the names of his parents. He always said them. He didn't know his grandparents' names. He knew who his siblings were, but his name is Willie Toombs. And I was like, okay. He once told me I was related to every Toombs in Little Rock, black and white. I have not proven that point yet. I do know every black Toombs in Little Rock I am related to, but I hadn't proven the white Toombs. But everywhere there's a set of white Toombs, my family seems to be somewhere near them, with one exception of Northeast Arkansas. We weren't in Northeast Arkansas, but in Tennessee and in Arkansas, we tend to be close to another set of Toombs that are white. And so still trying to flesh that out, but he was able to give me some insight into who he was, where he was from. Again, he knew his parents. His mother was Elizabeth Kelly Toombs, and she was born in Aberdeen, Mississippi. His father was Noxie Toombs, and that's the only name I ever heard was Noxie. Well, I found documentation that his name was Noxie. That was his middle name, but his first name was actually, let me get it right, Edward Noxie Toombs was his name. And that shocked me because Edward runs all up and down the family tree for names, but I never knew his first name was actually Edward till I found it on the census record in the 1800s. So again, those little details that you get from your family that you can remember, you can flesh those out with documentation. Let's go to that next slide, please, Heather. The locations are important because we think we may be the only one with a certain name, but we're not. Sometimes people have a duplicate name as ours. My name is Rhonda Stewart. There's several people named Rhonda Stewart, even though I say I'm the original. I may not be, but that's what I claim. But there's ways to differentiate which Rhondas you're talking about. Like race, I know black Rhonda Stewarts, I know white Rhonda Stewarts. Age helps you figure out which one you're talking about. Location helps you figure out which ones you're talking about. All kinds of things like that will help you decide if you're actually researching the person that belongs to you, or if you're researching someone who has a similar name as the person that belongs to you. Now, when it comes to locations, those are very important. Again, I knew Conway County was a place to research both sides of the family, the Stewart side and the Toombs side, because they both had memories. My grandparents both had memories of either living in that area or visiting that area when they were children. And so with my grandmother, I knew Little Rock, Morrilton, and Memphis were the three main places that she talked about. And in Little Rock, she moved here after her mother died, and she was just a teenager. She moved here with an older sibling, and they lived at 1200 block of Rock Street. I found her in the city directory, where I found the oldest sister, because city directors publish the head of the household, and sometimes you have to be an adult before your name shows up in the city directory. And so I found the older sister that she was living on Rock Street in the Little Rock City directories. At the time period, she said they were there. In Morrilton, I found her on the census records. I found some tax records in that area. And in Memphis, I'm still working on that. I don't get much time to do my own research, so I hadn't focused on Memphis that much. But I know for a fact that her grandparents, my grandmother's grandparents on her father's side, came out of Memphis, Tennessee. And when I was in college at Arkansas State University, I would go to Memphis because it was closer to Little Rock, but I never really liked Memphis, and I didn't know why. And now I have a theory why I don't like Memphis. And I will tell it now before I forget it. It's just a bad feeling I had when I went through Memphis as a college student. I didn't want to hang out there. It's okay to drive through, but I didn't want to be there. And when I did the research on my grandfather, Willie Toombs, I found out his grandfather, Richard Toombs, was a Civil War vet. And Richard Toombs actually survived the Memphis riots of 1866, right after the Civil War. Not to mention he survived the Civil War, but he survived the race riots in Memphis after the Civil War. Then he survived a flu outbreak in 1868 in Memphis, like kind of what we've gone through the last couple of years. And then he moved to Arkansas. And I was like, yeah, I'm glad he did that. And so to me, that was justification for my bad feeling when I went through Memphis. And now I understand it. And I can stay a little bit longer in Memphis. I can deal with it, but I wouldn't move to Memphis. And it has nothing to do with current conditions of Memphis or what they have to offer or not to offer. It was just a feeling I got when I was in college And that's one of the reasons I don't like going to Memphis to hang out. I like the music, I like sports, but that's about it. You know, get out of there. I got family over there. I'll go visit them every now and then. But just to hang out in Memphis, that's not me. Now, my grandfather's memories, he knew that he was born in Galloway, Arkansas. I found a record and he was indeed born. That was the place listed for his birth. It was Galloway, Arkansas, which is right outside of North Little Rock, going toward Lone Oak, that area. And he remembered Little Rock. I found evidence of which houses they lived in Little Rock. And he had always mentioned a place called West Rock. And I couldn't understand what was the difference between Little Rock and West Rock. Well, at the time, West Rock was on the edge of the city. It's over by Allsop Park, that area, right below the Heights on Cantrell. And it was a big area for a Black community. And there was quite a few family members over there. And so when I found them, I was like, oh yeah, there is a West Rock. And now there's more research out on West Rock community and more people coming out telling their stories about West Rock. So there's more for me to gather about that particular area. And then with Sagahatchee, first of all, the name fascinated me. I'm like, what does it mean? Where does it come from? Who knows what Sagahatchee is? Is it a real place? I've been to Sagahatchee, Arkansas. It's a mountain. It's a little mountain up there. It used to be called Toombs Mountain, if I'm not mistaken. But it is where my family members grew up after they moved from Memphis. And there's a church there, I forget the name of it, and a cemetery beside the church. And the names of several of my ancestors are on the headstones in that cemetery. And there's that little church was kind of interesting. The building still stands. And I don't think it's in use anymore, but just to sit on one of the pews, like one of my ancestors sat here. So it was kind of cool, like I say, just to visit that place. I've not been to Aberdeen, Mississippi yet. Aberdeen, Mississippi was where my grandfather's mother was from. And it was never just said Aberdeen, it was always Aberdeen, Mississippi. Well, in my research, I realized that several people in the Conway County area came out of Aberdeen, Mississippi. So it's real close to Memphis. It's right at that tri-corner of Mississippi, Tennessee, and Arkansas, right in that area. And so it's easy to understand how they mingled and all come to the same locations. And so those places were important. And so when I do my research, when I was trying to prove the oral history, I would look at everything about those locations that I could find, whether it was somebody's story, like the slave narratives. They're called U.S. interviews with former slaves now. They're available through Ancestry. If you read through some of that stuff and just put in like the location of where some of your folks may have been, like with Sagahatchee, or with Aberdeen, Mississippi, or Little Rock, or Memphis, or Morton, just plug in that location into that database of interviews with former slaves, and you'd be surprised what information comes up and what may be relative to your family and your research yourself. And even if your family was not involved in the slave trade, never owned slaves, anything like that, still use those databases because of the details that are in them. Sometimes people remember who owned the local store, who gave them credit at a store, or who was the big preacher in the area, or the traveling preacher that came through, or something like that. So don't disregard any database just because you don't think your family members were in it, especially in Arkansas, because regardless of the fact that we're in the South and people expect certain definitions to apply to us, like segregation and things like that, there were rules broken all the time, and Arkansas is really good at breaking rules. So we broke rules. You'll find people living together. You'll find people adopting interracially, all kinds of stuff in those early records. You just have to look for it. And again, someone may be mentioned in an interview that was not part of a situation, but because of their helpfulness or their kindness, someone remembered them and spoke well of them, or somebody remembered how mean they were and spoke well and spoke the truth about that also. But don't be afraid to look for the records. Don't be afraid to search any record for any person you're looking for. Because again, especially here in Arkansas, sometimes you'll find the records are intermingled with each other. So look for the locations with the family members. Next slide, please, Heather. You want to look in rural or urban settings. First of all, you want to narrow down the possibilities of where your families live. If your family's always been from Helena, West Helena, Arkansas, understand that today it may look like just a little small town, but look at the history of that place. Right after the Civil War, is one of the largest cities in the state of Arkansas. It had a large community. A lot of business people were in that community. There was a lot going on in the Helena, West Helena area. Same with Morrilton, Arkansas. There was so much going on. It was a city, and it was smaller than Little Rock, but they had a lot going on. And if your family tended to always live in a city or around a city, then you want to search certain databases. Like you want to look at city directories, you want to look at telephone books if they have them, school yearbooks, churches, cemeteries, township maps, census records. A lot of these you look for in the urban and the rural area. But if you're just looking in a rural area, say your family always lived in Sweet Home, Arkansas. Well, they may not show up in some of the city directories or telephone books. There may not be a yearbook that survived, but there's going to be some church records somewhere. You may actually have to go to the church to find those records. But if you check in a lot of different archives like us or the Arkansas State Archives or one of the college archives, you may find something specific to that church where they had an anniversary program or something and they list all the members, or they had a list of all the people that paid $1 for the church anniversary or whatever. You may find a family member's name that way. Fire insurance maps are good. Township maps actually map out that area. For instance, if I was talking about Sweet Home, that township map is going to tell me the name on that property as it shows it on the map. And so you get to see not only your family member's name, but the people around them, which may have become family members later, because sometimes we marry people that live close to us or that we've known all our lives and things like that. So whether you're looking in a rural setting or urban setting, again, you want to check all the databases that you can. You want to look through as much information as you can find. Nowadays, there's so many yearbooks online and more coming online all the time, especially as people find yearbooks. Someone passes away, maybe they didn't have children, but they had nieces and nephews that become heir to the property. And when they go clean out the property, they find a yearbook from 1910 or 1920 or 1930. They don't know what to do with it. A lot of times it ends up in the library or another archive, and we can get it now scanned and put online. So check the school yearbooks. A lot of people went to college, and you may not have known they went to college. The University of Arkansas at Fayetteville has yearbooks in our building that date back to the 1800s. There was a women's college called Galloway College. The Gallowean was the name of their yearbook, and it was an all-female college. And we have a couple of those yearbooks. We've had people from all over the country call when they realize we have those yearbooks and ask us to look for a picture of one of their family members that happens to show up in that yearbook. Telephone books, Little Rock has telephone books that go back to 1919. So if your family was lucky enough to be part of a telephone line or have their own telephone line in their house, and some people did, quite a few people did, you want to look through those telephone books. Not only do you want to look for their names, because it shows their name and the phone number and sometimes the address, but a lot of times the advertisement in the telephone books or the city directories may cover a business that your family member worked at or that they owned and ran themselves, and they may be listed as the owner of that business. It may be a photograph of them standing outside that business as part of an advertisement in the city directory or the telephone book that you had no clue existed because you never thought that or knew that that family member had a business. So you want to look through those type of items just to find what you can find. But most of us just regular people. We consume things. We don't build businesses and whatnot, because if everybody was a business owner, a lot of us wouldn't have any business because nobody would be buying our stuff, at least in my mind. So for the regular people, we want to look at the churches. Churches, especially in the South, are important for information. And most churches have an annual celebration of the number of years they've been in service to the community. So if you can find those annual celebration programs or resolutions that someone in the church has received from the city or another government entity, a lot of times there are details in that will give you information on your family member. Was he a deacon of that church? Was he one of the men that laid the cornerstone of that church? Did he donate the property the church is sitting on? Did he buy all the pews in the church? Was he the first Sunday school superintendent? Did she lead the choir? What? Was she the pianist? All kinds of details are in those church bulletins and those annual reports of the church anniversaries. So you want to look for those. And sometimes they are very vital information, bits and pieces of information on your particular family member. Because you may not have known that Big Mama actually was the one that led the choir, and they traveled all over the country for a while till she got to a place where she couldn't travel anymore. But that story is in that church anniversary, or there's a photo of her leading the choir or something like that. So again, do not underestimate what you can find with the smallest bit of information from a particular place, like a church, even though it's a small rural church, or it's a small church now that used to be a big church, or it's a huge church. Either way, ask the church if they have records. Ask them if you can look through those records, especially if you know your family belonged to that particular church, or if they were part of a certain denomination of churches, or if, especially if they were a minister. There are minister licenses that are available through databases on Ancestry, and also through some of our courthouse records that we have on microfilm. So what's online is good, but it's not everything. It's not everything. You're still gonna have to go through microfilm. You're still gonna have to go through newspapers. You're still gonna have to go through other records, books. There are people that have published their own books even before now, when everybody can publish a book on their own. There were people that were publishing books on their own in the 1900s and the 1800s and earlier. So you may find one that has survived. There are cookbooks in our building from the 1800s. Imagine if your great-grandmother was the one that put together that cookbook, and you see all of her recipes and you can repeat those recipes or something like that. Again, you have to learn to look for the evidence that would document your old histories. And so whether it's a rural area or an urban area, that information can be found, and it's good for us to look for it. Now, if we would, Heather, go to that next slide. Check it on neighbors. I always say check on the neighbors. Check on the neighbors, check on the neighbors, check on the neighbors. Think about your life right now. What kind of relationship do you have with your neighbors? I know it's 2022 and we're not as friendly as we used to be. Some of us are still very nosy and we know everything our neighbors are doing, even if they don't want us to know it. We find out. But we used to be more friendly, more neighborly in the past. So if you're looking for someone on your family tree and you don't find them, there could have been a mistake made. They could have been added to the household next to your family household. So when you're looking at census records, you want to look up and down the page at every name, because someone may have been misplaced. The interpreter, the person writing down the information, may have misunderstood or got distracted and wrote your name in the wrong location. So when you start looking at neighbors, you also want to look to see who are the closest neighbors to your family, and what other names on that page may jump out at you as somebody that is married into your family. For instance, your mother's sister married somebody with the last name Brown. Is there a Brown on that page that you're looking for all your stewards or tombs on? And that may be someone that actually married into the family later on, which will give you more clues about your family itself. Similar occupations by heads of households. What kind of work is being done by the people in that community? If you're looking at a record, especially a census record, and it's telling you the occupations, and you notice, okay, my grandfather worked for the railroad. I knew that growing up, but I didn't know he at one point worked for the WPA, Works Projects Administration. I found that record. And when I found that record, I started looking at all the names of all the men and that were working for the WPA, and quite a few of them from the same neighborhood. And so they're all working with this federal organization. And then a lot of them ended up at the railroad after the WPA work. And so you start looking at the heads of households and seeing what kind of work they're doing and where they're at and who they're working for. The same thing is true today. If you got a job at, say, Amazon, and your best friend got a job at Amazon too, because y'all told each other about the job, you're going to show up on those business records. But you may also show up in other records where they list your occupations, but it'd be long after we're gone before we'll be able to read that, because the censuses won't be out while we're alive, because they make us wait, but that's okay. But anyway, looking at the different households and the heads of households and what they're doing. If you're looking in the 40s and 50s and you're a Black female, chances are you're very limited in what occupations you can have outside of the home or inside of the home. Most times you're listed as a cook for a private family or domestic or laundress or some title like that. Understand what was available at the time your family members were alive. In 1930, we didn't have anybody that was in IT, no technology like we have today. In 1950s, there were people that worked at movie theaters, but not like we have them today working in movie theaters. It was a little bit different. They tended to stay a little longer. They didn't move around as much in jobs. They were always looking for the good jobs. And you would notice even the shifts in American locations. How many people moved from the South to the North at the time of the Industrial Revolution when the jobs opened up? You see that big shift. You see a shift from people living in the South, moving out west after the gold rush. So know what's happening in the area, why they would move, and whether or not your family members moved, went back and forth. One of my family members I know was in Tulsa, Oklahoma at the time of the Tulsa race riots. I believe two of them were there. I found one on the records right before the race riots, or the massacre as they call it now. And I found one on the record after the massacre. But I know for a fact two of them were there. And one of them's his name was Turley Toombs. I have an uncle, my mother's brother, whose name is Turley Toombs. So I was shocked to see there was another one named Turley, number one, because it's an odd name, I thought, but also Turley Toombs. And he was with his brother Clarence. And Clarence, I've tracked down. I know for a fact he is my great-grandfather's youngest brother. And they were both here in the Little Rock area at one point. As a matter of fact, four of those brothers were in the Little Rock area at one point. And as the youngest two moved around, they ended up in Oklahoma at the time. And that could be interesting too, because when you do the research on what happened in Tulsa, a lot of those people have Arkansas connections. The person, O.W. Gurley, that outlined the layout of Black Wall Street in Tulsa is from Pine Bluff, Arkansas. He was born in Alabama, but he lived in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, and he was working for the Postal Service before he went to Oklahoma. And so when you start realizing the connections there and the flow of migration from one state to another state, and start looking for your family members, did they go here with this group? Did they go with that group? Did she marry somebody and then followed him up to this state? You know, those records are out there for you to find, and you can find evidence of that. Intermarriage of neighbors is common. A lot of times we marry people we're comfortable with that's not too far away, because I can't be driving 6-7 miles to go visit you, and I work from sun up to sundown. Sometimes that's a little hard, but I'll walk 2 or 3 miles to come see you. That could have been the case. So look for that intermarriage of neighbors. Common birth states. How many folks in the area of your family are you researching that are actually from the same state? They were born in the same state. Like if I'm doing research in Conway County, Arkansas, I realized that there were several people in Conway County, Arkansas, that were born in South Carolina. And if they were born in South Carolina, what made them come to Arkansas? What was going on? And if you do the research, you'll find out there are lots of reasons to come to Arkansas. Some of them were federally sponsored, land opened up, or just the movement of people, like from Memphis to Arkansas after the Civil War. There was quite a few people that left Memphis area and came to Arkansas after the Civil War. And you'll see that a lot of those people were not born in Memphis or in the state of Tennessee, but they were born in North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, or Georgia, or Alabama before they got to Tennessee and then to Arkansas. Or they may have come up through Louisiana to Arkansas. So just find out where they were, what the people around them were doing, where they were moving around to, and what was happening in that area. Let's go to that next slide, Heather. Document examination for names. And I probably could have put that in a different format, that statement. But you want to examine every document for all the names that's listed on that document, because you may find some surprises. Who was the head clerk in the office where that document was filed. You'll find that name on there. That's why I say no matter what your race, no matter who you are, look at all the names on the document. Who are the witnesses? Who are the informants for vital records like birth, marriage, and death? On a birth record, sometimes, especially in Arkansas, because we started collecting in 1914. So 1914, before 1914, it's hard to find a birth record for a person in the state of Arkansas. Some do exist. Most times you have the census to depend on, or a church baptism record or something like that. But for an actual birth certificate, those people born before 1914, it's going to be hard to find anything on them. But if they're born after 1914, where the state of Arkansas actually started officially collecting, you can find lots of information, because a lot of those people that were born after 1914 were well into their adult years before they actually got their birth certificate. And after Social Security came about in the 1930s, lots of people wanted to make sure they had a birth certificate so they could draw Social Security or apply for Social Security. And so they would get what was called a prior birth, or they're listed as a prior birth index, where they would go to the office and they would have witnesses or letters of witnessing, or they would have documentation where they gave birth, or where they were listed as the daughter of somebody in an official record, and they would hand that over and get an official birth certificate. So there are lots of records out there that will have an adult applying for their own birth certificate. And that's important, because one record I saw just this morning where his father actually went in person and witnessed his daughter's birth certificate. I know she's my daughter. My wife gave birth at this time, such. So he was listed as a witness on her birth certificate, even though she was an adult when she applied. Daddy was still living, and she took him with her. Or you may find a letter from a relative, like a sister of your parent, or a cousin, or the godmother, or the midwife that was in the community that says, I remember this child was born at this time, and I'm giving my word that this is true. There are legal documents that people have to witness to or be a party of. If I was to sue you in court because you took my dog, and I know you took my dog, even though you say you didn't take my dog, and I'm gonna sue you to get my dog back, there's gonna be a record, and there's gonna be witnesses that I bring in, and there's gonna be documentation in that courthouse of everybody that was concerned with that case. There's gonna be a transcript of the record. All kinds of stuff like that will give you information about names to research, or names that will confirm your oral history as you know it. And so those are important. Newspaper articles, I love newspaper articles. Right now, if it's before 1923, we can get you a digital copy of that newspaper. We can go through it real fast to see if that name shows up in the newspaper. If it's after 1923, because of copyright issues, we can't do that. You have to come down and look at the actual microfilm and go through it page by page. But before 1923, it's so easy. And you just plug in a name, or you plug in a keyword, and it'll pull something up. If you didn't know, I mean, right now we got food trucks everywhere. We got caterers everywhere, all kinds of people doing their own thing. But in the newspapers before 1923, the same thing was happening. And they would print articles about different weddings or big time events, and who the caterer was, and what they served, and who they had serving the plates for them, the workers that they have. So you will find that kind of information in newspapers. So it helps you document the oral history that you may have. If grandpa had a great grandpa had a candy store, you'll find that out in the local newspapers, because there will be something advertising that store or talking about that store, whether the kids at the school got to go visit one day and watch how the candy was made or something like that. All of those descriptions are in the newspaper. If someone was killed, like today, people get killed all the time. A lot of times that showed up in the newspaper, and the details of that killing was in the newspaper, whether they got ran over by a truck or a train or drowned in a blue hole. All of that detail is in a newspaper article. And so you want to search the newspaper articles, because there's a big story going around now with this kid, and I forget what state he's in. He jumped in the river and rescued 3 girls and a police officer that had fallen in the river. And that's real cool. 100 years from now, somebody will be able to read about his act in a newspaper. It will be preserved like we look at old newspapers now. And so think about what could have happened. It's that time of year where a lot of people lose their life by drowning. I'm thinking of a friend of mine who was fishing one day and fell out of the boat and drowned. Nobody would have thought he'd been fishing all his life. He was an expert at it. But one day something happened. He fell over and lost his life because of it. That article will be in the newspaper. I will probably not be able, I can go look it up now on microfilm, but one year you'll be able to pull it up just randomly, like I'm looking at 1923 and earlier now for articles and things that happen in the newspaper. Also in the newspaper, there are pictures, there are descriptions of people. They get real nosy. Someone had a wedding. This is what she wore. This is what they ate. This is who was invited. This is what presents they brought. I'm like, they even listed the presents you brought to a wedding. I'm not sure I agree with that because I want nobody knowing whether or not my present was on the high end, the low end, or in the middle. That's a little too much information for me to put out there, but it's in the newspapers. So again, regardless of who you are, if you're looking for information on your family, check the newspapers because you may not think they did anything to end up in the newspapers, but they could have just because of the time that they were living in. Especially if they went to school, even just the first 3 years of school, because they would always list the school plays. They would sometimes list the teachers at the beginning of the school and the members of their homeroom classes. So you find things like that in the newspaper also. So again, you can document the family history. My grandmother talked about not going very far in school because they had to work. And so I was able to document that. Because on one of the census records, it talked about how much education she had. And so that was a part of the evidence that I had for documenting her oral history. Again, you want to look at the advertisements in any city directory, the yearbooks, anniversary programs, community history books. Look for county histories. And county histories mostly are not online because they were put together manually and they've been doing it for hundreds of years, basically, depending on what area you live in. But those county histories are really important because the people that took the time to write that down usually took the time to get the story correct, or at least the story as they wanted to present it. And once it's written down, regardless of whether or not it's correct or not, you can prove or disprove that story most times. So the fact that it's written down is important. So look for that evidence in written form. One way or the other, you'll find some way to justify or to figure out if you're looking at the right person at the right time and that it is indeed your ancestor. Let's go to the last page, Heather. Verify, verify, verify. And I say verify, verify, verify because we're competitive people. If you have a relative that is really competitive with you and to the fact that everything is a battle, she don't know as much as I know. I'm gonna put the family history together the way I want to because she didn't do it right, or she misspelled somebody's name, or she didn't look at this person or that person. And that's fine. Competition is fine. But verify, verify, verify. Because sometimes in your haste or your rush to compete against a family member and put together as much family and many family details as you can before they get it, we make a mistake or we write something down wrong. And so it's not anything bad. We're just human. So you want to verify. And a lot of the records, whether they're military or federal records or state records, sometimes the information is wrong because, again, human error. If I'm writing down that your birthday is 1918 and I accidentally wrote it where that 8 looks like a 6 and somebody's reading it later and they write 6 instead of 8, or they just made a mistake and got you confused with the line above you and wrote the wrong year down. Don't be upset. Verify. Military records are pretty good at getting birth years right. Census records will give you sometimes an about year, an approximate year of birth, because somebody may not remember it was 1916 or 1915 that they were born. They just know it was around that time and in the fall or something like that, especially if they were delivered by a midwife, especially in Southern United States. Sometimes those records didn't make it to the courthouse, didn't make it to anything official. They were just, they were kept by the midwife and then the memories of people that witnessed the birth. And sometimes they came out later, but you still can verify. The census record is going to tell you an approximate age of somebody. And if you get enough census records, like we got up to 1950 now, so some 1790 to 1950, we got census records. If you find someone in that census record, you can verify what year they were actually born, because there are other records you can compare it to. Like when they fill out an application for a Social Security card, which a lot of people have to do, they're going to tell you what year they were born. Sometimes they lie, sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's just an honest mistake. I made a mistake when my mother passed. I was sitting there, we're giving the information for a death certificate. They asked for a birth certificate. I said April 12th. And thankfully, my brother was sitting there. He said, no, that's your birthday. Hers is April 14th, because we're all born in April. And so without him being there, I would have given the wrong birth date for my mother. And I knew her birthday better than I knew mine, basically. But at that time, with all the emotions going on in my head, I gave out the wrong date. But he gave the right date, which I was glad for. The verify, verify, verify. The census is the same thing. Two different censuses can have two different years of birth. So you want to find another record that will confirm, or either that 1 year is right or another year is right. Or you may get, some cases, you'll find a woman in every census her birth year is off a year or 2 years or 5 years. And every now and then it's off 10 years. I'm like, oh, she's going backwards. But you can still verify through other records when our actual date of or year of birth is, because you'll find something that will verify. When she got married, was she old enough to get married without anybody giving her permission to get married? Or did she have to have a parent sign off giving permission? Things like that. Public member trees. If you're doing your family tree and you didn't realize great grandpa had 12, 13 siblings, one of those siblings could have a great grandchild that's also doing the family tree. And the information they have is a little bit different from what you have, but some of it connects, and you can verify, okay, the line of order of the siblings, she got right, I got it right. The birth years are basically the same. So that's verification that, yeah, you probably got it close to, if not correct, what their year of birth was. World War I, World War II draft registration cards are great for verifying ages of men and some women, because again, women served in both of these wars to some degree. They also served in the Civil War. So you can find records for women in the Civil War also. And so you want to verify those records. And a lot of times those are estimates for the Civil War, because we weren't as strict about keeping up with our year of birth then. But again, for the purpose of receiving benefits, they had to verify when they were born and when they served. The United States Confederate soldiers compiled service records. The details in that, you'll find all kinds of little information, little details that'll help you, number one, decide that, yes, this is the family member I'm looking for. Yes, he was in this service. After this, he applied for his pension or whatever. There's other ways to verify. Like I said, verify, verify, verify that you got the right information and the right person, because there's going to be somebody that's listed as a next of kin in case they're died, or in case they die or something like that, or somebody listed as a widow or widower of that particular person. The Social Security Death Index is fairly new, 1935 to 2014, but again, it's great for verifying when someone died, which will also confirm their year of birth, because on the Social Security Death Index, they're going to tell you about when that person was born. Even if they don't have the month or the day right, they usually have the year right. And so you want to check with that. Again, the death certificates are as good as the people giving the information. And like I said earlier, sometimes we make mistakes because it's a time of grief. It's emotional, and things are easy to mess up during that time period as far as giving out that information. So you want to verify again, even with a death certificate or a birth certificate. Those marriage certificates are really cool. What I like to do is, and I'm not morbid, I'm not wishing anybody a bad marriage, anything like that. But if I'm looking for a marriage record for you, I'm also going to look to see if you divorced. because sometimes the ages are different on the two different records. Sometimes you got married, you divorced, and then you remarried the same person. And the age may be different in all three different locations. So again, I would have to verify. Number one, that it's the same person and he or she just didn't marry somebody with the same name. And then again, I want to make sure those birth years are as close as possible. The birth year is what's important because it helps you distinguish which generation you're actually researching. If your great grandfather was a junior and his dad was the senior, you want to know which guy you're actually looking at which time period. And that birth year will be helpful to distinguish which one it is that you're researching. You also want to look at, again, cemetery records. I got Oakland and Fraternal Historic Cemetery up here because, again, growing up, I would hear, okay, Oakland, that's the white cemetery. Fraternal, that's the black cemetery. No such thing, especially in the state of Arkansas. A lot of times you will find both races or every race in every cemetery. These are city cemeteries. So for the city of Little Rock, you could be buried in either one of these. Oakland had a paupers area, so that Fraternal, but Oakland's was bigger. So there were people that were born in the paupers area of Oakland that was every race. It's also sitting next to the Jewish cemetery. So there may be some mix over there with records. And then Fraternal, which was deemed the all black cemetery, sometimes you find white people buried there also. Not a whole lot, but it's there. Just do the research. And the names sometimes will get mixed up which cemetery they were buried in because today they operate as one big cemetery park. But in the past, they were two separate, or actually it was 7 different cemeteries over in that area because National was there. And then we got the Jewish cemeteries in Oakland and Fraternal, the Confederate cemetery, all kinds of cemeteries all in that same area. So you want to look at the records to see how they distinguish between the cemeteries and who was buried there, who buried them, what went on. When you're looking for burial records, also look for the funeral homes in the area. If they're still operating, go to those funeral homes, ask them if they can let you browse their record books, if they haven't published anything on them. Here in Little Rock, in our building, Dubeson Funeral Home is an old African-American cemetery funeral home business that's no longer in existence. But their records from 1925 through 1965 are in our building because a few years ago, some local genealogists decided, some preservationists, hey, can we publish the list of names you got for all these people that you buried? And they were given permission to do so. And so we have a 3-volume set of books on our shelf that will tell you who they buried between 1925 and 1965, the location of that burial, the ages of those persons, and whether, all the details of that death are basically in those books, as far as the lifespan, where they were buried, which cemetery, who had the bodies, whether it was out of town, in town, things like that. And that will lead you to more information if you're researching different family members. Again, if there was a family member that was born after a census and died before the next census, there's not a lot of ways that you can verify who that person was unless they were born during a time when birth certificates were prominent. If they were not, like if they were born before 1914, sometimes the only time you will find them is in a cemetery listing or in a funeral business listing of burials. And babies were often buried for free. So a lot of businesses, funeral businesses, kept those records of babies that were buried. And you can find out, again, which ones were born and died in between the census record. But again, our state of Arkansas is starting to publish a lot of that information that they had, and it makes it a little bit easier for us to do that research. But again, human error. If I'm putting information into this computer for you to research, and I'm talking to my friend over here, or they got something that's smelling good that caught my attention, I'm asking for a bite of their food or something, I might miss a name when I go back, or I might confuse 2 names. So again, you want to verify, because it's not that we intentionally are misleading you as we transcribe these records and whatnot. Sometimes it's just human error, or we're not paying attention like we should, or sometimes we just are bad at our jobs. I mean, it's that simple sometimes. So again, you can prove the oral history. The thing is to try to remember as many details as possible. Also, even if you don't quite remember, like in my own family, I remember the question being asked of my grandfather, did anybody he know fight in the Civil War? Well, he had heard somebody in the family fought in the Civil War, but he didn't know for sure. And so when I started doing my research, that was in the back of my head. He had heard someone fought in the Civil War. Well, I was able to prove his connection to a Civil War vet. His grandfather, who died in 1890, and my grandfather was born in 1905, so he would not have known the man. His grandfather fought in the Civil War. And when I was able to make that link, I was able to also apply for a Civil War certificate from the state of Arkansas through the Arkansas Genealogical Society. And if you don't know, you can apply for citizenship through the Arkansas Genealogical Society for your family members, or a Civil War certificate for your family members based on the fact that they lived in the state of Arkansas. My family has been in Arkansas prior to the Civil War, so I got that certificate stating my family has been here that long from the Arkansas Genealogical Society. And I also got the Civil War certificate. And for me, the coolest thing is my mother's youngest brother, his name is Charles Knox Toombs. He's named after both of his grandfathers, Charlie and Knox. And so he has a son with that same name. But when I got the certificate for the Civil War ancestry, because of my research, I was able to link him directly to that male ancestor. So it's from male ancestor that served in the Civil War to the youngest brother of my mother, who's a descendant of that male ancestor. And so those names will connect always in the state archives for Arkansas Civil War certificates. And I was able to do that just by verifying the oral history and proving with documentation everything that was said to have happened in my family. So with that, I'm gonna shut up and see if y'all got any questions specifically for me.
You know they do. I have put, first of all, I've put some stuff in the chat fairly early in the chat about a link to the databases that we have here at CALS. If you're not, like I said in the intro, if you're not a CALS patron, if you do not live in Pulaski or Perry County, then I would check with your local library. Most libraries subscribe to these kind of services. And I also put a link in about the, the DIY Memory Lab, personal archiving, as well as the genealogy workshop. And somebody asked if that workshop was free, and it is. Most everything, I don't even know that we know how to charge people for our stuff. So I think everything
we like showing people how to do free stuff.
Yeah, we're free. We'll also come talk to your group for free. I should always throw that in there, Rhonda.
No.
Okay,
yeah.
I will come talk to your group for free. Okay, so we have
40 hours it out. we will make arrangements to come speak to groups.
We talked to a family reunion group 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
So if you, and also you can type your questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand and we'll call on you and you can answer live. Okay, so I really hope I'm going to get her name right. Valandria. I really hope I get points for that.
It's Valandra.
Valandra. Darn it. Oh, I really try hard too. I worked on that. I was sitting there looking at you with that, you know, so she says, I have a death certificate and WPA transcript of an interview of my third generation grandmother. The transcript states she said she was born 3 years after surrender, so 1868, and her death certificate states she was born 1859. Any suggestions on how to verify which could be correct? What documents would be best to explore next? That's a great question.
Yeah. First of all, there's a 10-year difference basically in the date of birth, and that's an easy mistake to make. I would go with the earliest record, which whenever she did the interview, when was it conducted, what was going on? Also, if she was born in either of those years, she should show up on that 1870 census, and she should show up on the 1880 census. So I would compare those two censuses to see if they have the same information as either one of those dates. I would also look to see if she was born in 68, by 88, by 1900, she should be married because there's no 1890 census. But I would look for a marriage record between 1880 and 1900 to see if she got married during that time period and what her age was. If she didn't get married at that time period, I would look, depending on where she lived, to see if she was working for someone, and they may have mentioned her age or something, especially if she's doing private household work. They may mention the age. I got this 14-year-old that's working for me or whatever, because kids worked really young back then. But the 1870 and 1880 census will be where I will focus first. And then if she's in a city, I will go to the city directories, because if she's an adult, they're going to list her eventually in the city directory. Even if she's married, she would show up as the spouse of somebody in the city directory, which could lead you again to a marriage record. Also, if you know of any of the siblings' names, if she has siblings, I would look to verify their birth order and where she would fit in between those siblings. Because if she had a sister that was her best friend, they were only 2 years apart, you can pretty much gauge what year she was born. Or she had a brother that took care of her because the parents died while she was a young one, and he basically raised her. You could also verify that way about what age she is. If she grew up with his kids and whatnot, and they have 2 kids in the household that's the same age or very close to age. Just get creative and look for other areas where her age may be mentioned. But the 1870, 1880 census would be the 2 I would look the most for.
Okay, thank you.
Also, when you're looking for these records, understand, especially here in Arkansas, a lot of us have nicknames. And so even though you're looking for that legal name, Rhonda Stewart, you may not know that they call me Boo Boo or Pokey or whatever, depending on what age you're referring to me at. Maybe when I was a youngster, they called me Biscuit. I do have relatives that are named Biscuit, nicknamed Biscuit. And then as I got older, nobody called me Biscuit anymore, but in college, they called me Crook. And so a lot of people knew me by that name. So get imaginative, use your imagination. If you see a name that doesn't quite fit, or it seems odd or out of place, check the age record, check the gender, and see if it fits the person you are researching. But that 1870 and 1880 census would be where I would start.
Jennifer would like to know, she says, I'm new to researching genealogy. Where is the best place to start?
Right here in our building. If you're local, do come in, because there's so much that's not online that you can use. But if you're not able to come in, use the online databases. And the census records, like I said, from 1790 through 1950 are online. They're available. Even if you don't have Ancestry, you can use Heritage Quest or Fold3 through our library with a library card, or you can come into any library building and use those databases. You can also use Family Search, which is free. Family Search is out of Salt Lake City, Utah. All you have to do is register by giving them an email address, and they don't bug you too much, not much at all, but they'll allow you to use their databases to search. And so start with the census records and building that record for every 10 years, following that person till you can't find them anymore, and seeing who they're around, who's in the household with them, who they're sharing living space with. Because sometimes they may be lending a room to a college student or a high school student from another town. And that's how you keep up with your family member, because you realize that person that went out to college ended up being my great aunt, or something like that. And so again, start with the databases and then use everything else, newspapers, different collections of names, the city directories, the telephone books, the yearbooks, church anniversaries, anything that has a list of names. Tax records are really good. You can find that. Most people have to pay taxes, and you're gonna find a record of where they paid their taxes in the newspaper or online in the courthouse records and things like that. Look for land records. There's all kinds of databases, but I would start with the census if you're just getting started because it gives you a framework to work with.
Here's another question. What's the name of the Black Cemetery in Little Rock?
Well, right now there are several, but prior to 1950, it was mainly Fraternal. It was the big one. It's where all the celebrities are buried, Black celebrities. It's where the normal people are buried also. It used to go from 21st Street all the way down to Roosevelt Road, from Barber Street all the way over to McAllen. Basically, it was a very large piece of property that was the cemetery. Horace Mann sits on what used to be part of the cemetery. Kroger on Roosevelt sits on what used to be part of the cemetery. Kroger, Dollar Tree, used to be a Young's fish store there one time. The fire station that's over there, all of that used to be part of the cemetery. So that was the oldest and largest part of African-American cemeteries. And after 1950, we had Haven of Rest opened up, I believe, shortly after that time period. In the surrounding suburbs like Sweet Home and Hensley and College Station, there are all kinds of small church cemeteries or smaller cemeteries that community own. But the large cemeteries, for the most part, are Fraternal and Haven of Rest were the main two. There was one in North Little Rock that Holiday Inn sits on now. Those bodies were supposedly moved to some of the other cemeteries on the south side of the river. May or may not have happened, but there are records that have been recreated of some of the people that were buried in those cemeteries also. Look at the Catholic cemetery. Little Rock has always had a large Black community in the Catholic Church, and so some of them are buried in the Catholic cemetery right there on Wright Avenue in Woodrow. Roselawn Cemetery has had multiracial burials for a long time. So, but historically, like I say, in Little Rock, we were always different. We do our own thing. We break the rules all the time. But historically, Fraternal was the Black cemetery in Little Rock, and it was city-owned. So that was one. But there's quite a few Black people buried in Oakland, right across the street, especially if they were buried as a pauper or somebody that didn't have the money to be buried. Then the city would bury them in Oakland. I found a few of my relatives buried in Oakland. I was like, why are they in Fraternal? And a lot of times it's because they were buried as a pauper. And makes sense to me because I'm not going to give you all that money if I can get the city to bury. It depends on what time you're looking at and what's going on. But those are the main cemeteries for people of color in the city of Little Rock historically.
We have a question from Dora. She says, my great-grandfather does not show on any census with his parents because of the 1890 census. He wasn't living at home in the 2000 census. Any suggestions?
Yeah. With that record, because he doesn't show with his parents, you want to try to find his death certificate where somebody may have known the name of his parents and listed it. You also want to know if he had siblings and look for their death certificates, especially the older siblings who would have known the parents and may have listed it or passed that information down to the person that was the informant on their death certificate, that his daddy's name was Jim and his mama's name was Louise or whatever. And sometimes you can back into that information that way. Otherwise, look for that surname in the closest census, like 1880. And you know, Grandpa said he grew up in England, Arkansas. I would search all of Lonoke County for that surname in 1880. And then again, I would search all of Lonoke County for that surname in 1900. Because again, an older sibling or a cousin could still be living in that area, which will lead you to information about the possible parents. And then you can research those names when you find them to see if they died at a certain time, or on some census records, especially with the females, it'll tell you how many children they've given birth to and how many children are still alive at that point that record was taken.
She says, thank you. I'll look. He had a younger sister. So yeah, that's a good way to start.
Yeah, go backwards sometimes, like start with the death certificate and see what information is there and go backwards.
A couple of things I always like to point out to people, in the last 10 to 15 years, technology has really changed how genealogy is done. Used to, you had to go through card catalogs and you had to scroll through things individually, and there was lots of time and effort, and it still takes lots of time and effort, but there's a lot of stuff that's very searchable and very online. One thing I always recommend people, especially if you have an unusual last name, if your name Albert Smith, this may not work, but Google Books, and this is not Google Play Books. This isn't where you go to buy the latest novel and pay $12.99 to get it on your iPad. This is Google Books, and it started out as a partnership with Cornell University, and they are scanning thousands, probably up to millions now. We'll give them credit for it. Books, different pamphlets, all kinds. So like if your relative was a doctor and attended a medical conference in 1919, they could be listed in a pamphlet that has been scanned. So you go to Google Books, and it's books.google.com. I always forget that it's backwards. So it's called Google Books, but it's books.google.com. You type in their name and it'll pull up. It'll also pull up your that name. It may or may not be your relative, but that name in secondary sources like histories of the Civil War or whatever. So you can find some kind of directions that way. And I always tell people, like, look on social media, find the social media groups on Facebook and Instagram that have your surname, because somebody may have done some research already and can hand it over to you. Cousins love to hand over stuff. Folks, genealogists love to talk about their families and where they found the information. So check that out too, because that can be really helpful.
And if you get an opportunity to go to a workshop, go to a workshop. Like the one we have in October the 1st. I went to Sacramento to the National Genealogical Society Conference in May, and I guarantee you there were so many people there with Arkansas connections or researching relatives that had lived in Arkansas. Yeah. And me being from Arkansas, of course, they had lots of questions for me, and just to have that insight into what they already knew and what I could tell them about different locations or whatever, or where to search for different records is important. At a genealogy conference, the one I went to, the national one, before the pandemic, it was nothing for them to have 2,500 people at one conference, all doing the same thing, and just to have that different people providing different ways that they did their research that may be useful for you. But on a smaller level, like the one we have, we used to draw about 300 people to this conference every year. And just to have that many people, we've had cousins find each other in that building at the time of that workshop because they didn't know they existed, but we started talking about what name are you researching? And they realized, oh, that's my grandfather's sister, or that's my great-grandmother's brother. You got two lines coming together in one building who didn't know each other prior to that meeting. So if you get a chance, do attend virtually or in person is better for me. And just to get that vibe, that feeling of what it's like. And also because I explain something one way, someone else may explain it a way that will give you more insight into how you could do it best for you. It's always good to have different viewpoints.
What?
I said it's always good to have different viewpoints. Yes. Yeah.
Well, and please remember, before October 1st, I'm going to be blue in the face by the time I finish saying this as many times as I'm going to have to say it. The genealogy workshop on October 1st will not be recorded. It will not be live streamed. So you have to attend either virtually or in person that day. So it won't be up. It won't be up later. And we've gotten people in the habit of recording and live streaming. So, okay, we have another question. If you know a relative was enslaved but ran away and was a fugitive, what records would you go to look for them? They had been enslaved in Richmond, Virginia, and ran away to Charleston, Mississippi. they won't show up on census, right? Or would they?
It depends on what name they're using. But a good thing is one of the schools in Virginia, I forget which one right now, but they're putting together a list of the records they have related to slavery. And there's quite a few because slavery is a business. So you want to look for the record. It may only have a first name and the age and the gender, but a lot of times you can narrow down the person that you're researching. If they ran away from Virginia and ended up in Mississippi, chances are they were looking for a family member. So you want to look for that family name. It may not be the surname that you think it is. You want to look at the first name, especially if it's what we would consider an unusual name. May not be unusual at the time that of the runaway, because it could have been several Pearlies or Pink. Pink was a man's name back in the 1800s, and it is fairly common, pink and green and orange. But still, you want to look for that name in the area that you think they went to. Look for advertisements advertising whether or not they're looking for someone that had run away with that name. And it usually gives you a description of the person, gives you who they may be looking for as they ran away or which direction they may have gone. So there are all kinds of, again, the newspaper would be useful in that sense. If it's after 1870, of course, they don't have to run anymore. You can find records of them somewhere. And usually that 1870 census, as many people as could wanted to be written down on the record to prove their existence. So there's a lot of information in that 1870 census. And again, in 1880, when they got to do it again. So those two censuses are really good for documenting who your folks are, where they are, and what area they're in. From 1880 to 1900 makes it difficult because of that 1890 census, but still there are other records you can back into, like I say, that information through marriage records or death records or something like that. You can find some clues. Again, the churches may be where you're looking for that information, because baptism records do exist. Some of them survive, even from the late 1800s, early 1900s. There's a listing of who got baptized in the river, on a certain day, or who was on program for the Easter service, or Heather mentioned earlier about Google Books. There's listings of people that travel from Arkansas to Switzerland for a Baptist convention. And I'm like, wait, that's a long way to go, and why and how, but their names are there. And so I wouldn't consider a Southern preacher going all the way to Switzerland for a Baptist convention, but they did. So get rid of your own biases and learn to look for your people wherever they are. If your person was a slave holding person, again, it is a business. Don't let the emotion of the business disrupt you from doing the research. Because if you look at it like it's a business, there's going to be a record somewhere of what happened to that property, when that property was freed, if they were freed, or sold, if they were sold, or if they died because they have to claim it on their taxes or whatever. There's a record. And most times those records are in a courthouse somewhere.
And the Freedmen Bureau records are out there. They're at the National Archives. They have a website. So that's a possibility. Also, there's a huge collection of plantation records from all over the South. They're on microfilm. They're all over the country. There aren't many here, but I don't think do we have any reels of that? Do you know what I'm talking about, Rhonda? That huge collection?
Yeah, I do, but I don't know if we have it. We do have the Southern Claims Commission. Yes. That's where people applied to get money back that the federal government took during the war. Like they took all the chickens off their farm or something like that, and they applied to get their money back or get paid for what they lost in property. So whether you're black or white, you want to search those records because there's evidence there sometimes of your family member's existence.
And some of those transcripts are fascinating because neighbors turned on neighbors and were like, no, you were a Confederate. You don't try to say you weren't. Those are on fold 3. You can get those on fold 3 as well. So there's lots of stuff out there. I've put the link to the genealogy workshop back in the chat at the bottom. the transcripts were the Southern Claims records, Dora. And we would like everybody to register online, even if you're not going to participate in Zoom, even if you're going to come in person, if you'll register just in case, just by the crazy chance we might have to pivot and be all virtual. I mean, it's not like we've done it before. So just in case, if you'll register, so we'll kind of have an idea of who is coming, but there's a link there. It's just, if you Google 2022 genealogy workshop CALS, you should be able to find it. Someone also asked if the PowerPoint would be available. This has been live streamed to YouTube, and so it will be available on YouTube immediately following this program. I will try to remember tomorrow to send an email with that link to everybody, but if you go to the CALS YouTube page, go to youtube.com, type in Central Arkansas Library System. Don't type in CALS, you'll find stuff in California. Central Arkansas Library System. It should be the first video that pops up because it will be the most recent. That was a lot.
Yeah, it's been a good group.
It has been a good group.
Y'all ran out of time. It's time to go now.
Yes, it's time to go home. So thank you everybody for being here. We're here every month. Also, personal archiving is the third Thursday of the month at 3:30 here on Zoom with me. And the Memory Lab is always open. So make an appointment and we'll help you get your stuff digitized.
Tell
Thank
your
you very
story.
much.
Yeah.
Yep.
Tell your family story.
Yep. Record it. Write it down.
All right. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.